Okay, everybody. I think for everybody's time, we will now start. And thank you very much all for joining us today. And your sort of presenters today on regional Createch clusters are myself and Trevor Davis. I don't know, Trevor, if you want to sort of wave your hand and say something.
Something.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. So we've been really looking at the whole sort of Createch area for some time, collaboratively, and I am director of the Centre for Sustainable Design at UCA. And then Trevor, maybe a word on yourself.
Yeah, I'm a ex-IBM distinguished engineer these days, acting as an independent researcher alongside Martin, looking at Createch and sustainability in the creative industries.
So part of the work that we've been doing really over the last 3+ years now, we've been fortunate to get funding from UKRI's Strategic Priorities Fund, which has enabled us to do some sort of proactive work around the emerging area of Createch. And as I mentioned there, in fact, our first report was just published, or the last workshop, foresight workshop we did for the first study was actually just before the pandemic. So we really started to sort of look out to 2030 in terms of the creative industries and look at the role of Industry 4.0 and sustainability in the creative industries. And since then, we've run a series of reports, particularly starting to hone down more into the Createch sector, and looking at that in a UK context, and then more recently looking at specifically in a Surrey context. So those reports are available online, and if you haven't been able to access those, please let us know and we'll send that on. So what we've sort of noted really over the last 4 to 6 weeks or so, a number of notable sort of influencers and opinion formers around UK creative industries and creative industries research have started to use the word Createch. Quite broad to some extent, but the interesting point there is they are starting to use the word Createch. And I think this also perhaps comes or aligns to post UK budget. UK government has sort of jumped up out of the parapet and have then highlighted that the creative industries is one of the key priority sectors in the UK. And perhaps one of the other sectors being the digital technologies, there's a sort of crossover potential being seen for sort of competitive advantage of UK, maybe. So our agenda today is, Trevor and I are going to do a bit of a double act, and then we have some excellent invited speakers who are going to talk on different aspects of Createch clusters and different role players' perspective on that area. So without sort of further ado, I'll just get into the first section of this before I pass over across to Trevor. So just in outline, sort of the flow, we'll present the findings, discuss regional challenges, and then we will, through our colleagues, share some different perspectives on the system, if you like. And then there'll be opportunities for questions and Q&A, and then we can sort of look at, opportunities and next steps. So creative industries is a sort of big sector, but it doesn't necessarily neatly fall within the classical, in a UK context, standard industrial classifications. And this is particularly a problem when you start to look at the convergent area of Createch. So within the work and the studies we've done, we've started to sort of project out as to how we see the different segments of the creative industries moving forward over the next sort of 10 years or so. And we've sort of particularly, honed in on the area of where technology is going to impact on the creative industries. And we see quite significant growth potential in that area. Again, we're going to sort of move over some of these slides, but the detail is in the reports that you saw earlier. So, please feel to follow up on that. But I'd say, probably, the key sort of mega trend, if you like, is the fact that technology is weaving itself into all forms of the creative industries. Even traditional sectors like the craft sector, you wouldn't thought technology is moving into, it is. So if you want to come away with one key thing, technology is weaving itself across and into different creative industries. And this whole specific area of particularly what we're thinking of as business to business technologies that are feeding into the creative industry segments is becoming a distinct sector in itself. So within the definition of Createch, there is a slightly broader definition which includes, a range of different technologies and systems to take forward the technologies. And within that definition, there is perhaps a core Createch definition that really clusters around 4 key areas: AI-powered platforms and content, Web 3.0, blockchains and metaverses, workflow automation and advanced analytics, and 3D capture and immersive technologies. So this is quite a sort of technology or product orientated methodology, if you like, or definition. But we have an even more specific one that we've used and really been trying to hone our thinking around, which really talks about technologies that are defensible. We're thinking about these as mainly B2B technologies, and really Createch companies are growth-oriented businesses that fit within the creative industries segments as defined by DCS in the UK, where technology assets are central to the value proposition of the company, and the business or operating model effectively is delivered by digital technologies. But in our recent dialogue in this emerging sector, as indicated earlier, we've started to see the opinion formers related to the creative industries and research in the sector coming up with a slightly broader definition. So we're open to all thinking, I would say, and Trevor, I'm sure, will reinforce that. This is not a done deal. It's quite bleeding edge in many areas. There's some we don't cover it today, but there's some significant investments being made in different companies in the sector. And it's a very live sector. So without further ado, I'll pass across to Trevor now to discuss the sort of what we found in terms of the regional perspective.
Thank you very much, Martin, and good afternoon, everybody. Martin, next slide, please. Obviously, quite a number of people on the call are from the UK, but some are not. And so a quick introduction to Surrey. It's a leafy green part of the country, southwest of London, or southwest of London and a bit. It's got about 1 million people in it. It's a real 50-50 mix of country and town, with some very beautiful areas of outstanding beauty running through the middle of it. Historically, it's been known as a commuter belt. It's got good communication links into London. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of legacy financial services in the sector, or people working in financial services. You've got a strong historical set of links to aerospace, pharmaceutical, gaming, high tech, and it's also got a great set of educational resources. Certainly, if you look at the higher education side, you've got obviously the University for the Creative Arts in 2 locations. You've got University of Surrey, and you've got Royal Holloway in Egham, and then quite a number of high caliber colleges as well. Next slide, please. So not surprising. Oh, back 1 slide. And forward 1 slide, thank you. So not surprisingly, there's already an ecosystem for both the creative industries and Createch in Surrey. So film, TV, there's a lot of studios around the borders of the county. The gaming kind of industry in particular is very strong. There's almost 100 games studios in Surrey, mostly clustered around one town, which is Guildford. And therefore, not surprisingly, between film and TV and games, you've got a value chain that these Createch companies can thrive in. But there's a lot of other creative kind of industries in the sector as well, and this makes it an extremely fertile ground for Createch companies who are spreading out into areas like music streaming or digital marketing. Next slide, please. So who are these companies in the county? Well, here's just a few examples for you. You can read this slide from yourself, but you can see they're very varied. Everything from people who are really focusing on supporting big brands and advertising agencies, through to people who are really more very close to the cryptocurrency world. And as Martin said in his introduction, if we look within Surrey, we would say probably 3/4 of the companies that we're looking at are at B2B, which I think is interesting because a lot of the focus, certainly a few years ago, was really more on business to consumer, immersive type Createch companies. But we're seeing a kind of broadening of that perspective. Next slide, please. So how much money is Createch worth to Surrey? That there are non-financial benefits of these companies. They have quite a positive social impact. They're important for placemaking as well. But if you can't make money out of them, then they're probably not long-term sustainable. And what I've done here is really take the Createch kind of subsector, which is in blue, and you'll see the film and TV in grey, and then in green, the game development and publishing, but not the retail side. And this is the gross value add for those 3 subsectors. And I think, as you can see from the shape of the chart from this forward projection, that even with the uncertainties we have built into our models, that Createch is going to be roaring away by the end of the decade. Now, one of the challenges that we do have is actually getting a handle on how many of these companies there really are. They typically use about 4 or 5 standard industry classifications to identify themselves. If we just counted those up in Surrey, it would be 6,000 of them, which is clearly not correct. We think the true number is probably around about 300 of these companies at the moment. And so they're actually generating quite a lot of gross value add per individual company, and we expect that to continue to grow. Next slide, please. Surrey does have a number of great strengths for these Createch companies. There are clearly a lot of customers in the area. There are quite a lot of academic research capabilities in the area, and these companies do tend to be very research led in terms of what they're doing. And it's obviously a very highly educated workforce within the county. There are some corresponding weaknesses, which is it's actually quite an expensive place to live. There tends to be a lack of commercial property, and the digital infrastructure in some of the rural areas is maybe not quite as strong as it needs to be for Createch. And there's a disparity between the east and the west of the county in terms of kind of general kind of availability of high-paying work, standard of living, etc. But despite all of that, there's still a lot of opportunity for Surrey to distinguish itself. It's in a good starting position to become perhaps the leading area for Createch in the UK. And in particular, there's a lot of emphasis in the public sector on kind of clean technologies, green growth, and there are some very interesting connections there with Createch. So there's a lot of potential spillovers as well into other areas which are being developed economically within Surrey, such as aerospace and space in particular, where imaging technologies are coming out of Createch that can also be used in those sectors. There are quite a lot of people in the ed tech area who are making use of Createch, for instance, to produce virtual learning environments. But unfortunately, there's a few threats. There is a skill shortfall, which we'll come back to a bit later. It is quite close to London, and London is still a magnet, really, for investment in this particular area and also for talent. There's also some kind of uncertainties about, obviously, the future of the UK economy, but we won't go too far into that one here. Next slide, please. So it starts to get quite interesting when you start mapping out where these companies are across Surrey. So the green line here is the boundary of the county. And we've taken a few liberties in including some which are just over the boundary for a reason I will explain in a few moments. But you can see they tend to cluster around the larger towns, or they cluster around transport hubs like railway stations, or they're close to their customers, particularly, on the near areas like Shepperton, where there's film studios, and out towards, kind of the north of this map as well, where there are also film studios. And the reason we've included some of the others who are outside of the boundary, like the ones to the bottom right in the Brighton and surrounding area, is that many of these actually started within Surrey, but for reasons of rent, for talent availability, or for lifestyle reasons, have actually moved out of the county. And we do see a flow between Sussex, which is the county where Brighton is, and Surrey, forward and backwards. Now, if you look at the breakdown, you can see still about a quarter of the Createchs that we're looking at here are in immersive. Increasingly, these immersive ones are getting involved in virtual production for film, which is also a growth area. Gaming, not surprisingly, is number 2 on our last list with about a fifth of them. But there's a good spread across pretty much every sector in the creative industries. And there are some that when we actually started to examine them in more detail, we couldn't quite work out exactly who they're aligned to. And I think this is a characteristic of, obviously, startups. They think that maybe their customers are marketeers, and then they find actually that what they're offering is more attractive to theatre or film or dance or to craft. So we do see, some that are still making their mind up what they're going to be when they grow up. Next slide, please. This is another take on the same group of companies or the same group of Createchs. On the left-hand side, what we're looking at is proximity to where the gaming companies are. So the red blobs on the left-hand side are gaming companies, and the blue ones are the Createchs, and the blue shaded areas are kind of loose clusters of smaller studios in commuting distance or travel to work distance. And then on the right-hand side, we can see in a bit more detail the film studios. I think what's maybe slightly misleading is it looks like a lot of the film studios are outside of the county, which is true. But obviously a lot of post-production type work and pre-production type work takes place in the county, and a lot of location work takes place in the county. And again, this makes it very attractive for Createch. And we shouldn't forget as well, there's a long history of music production in the county as well, and particularly with the rise of streaming, this has also attracted various kinds of Createch. So you can see that there's a kind of a ecosystem here, which is actually quite healthy already in terms of numbers of businesses and number of customers for those businesses. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that Martin and I discovered quite early on doing this piece of work is that because so many Createch are technology rich, intellectual property rich, require specialist skills, they're very dependent on having specialist professional services in particular, like the right kind of lawyers, the right kind of accountants, access to recruitment specialists. And one of the things that is very distinctive about Surrey is that there are a lot of these specialist support organizations already in the region. Again, you can see, if you look to the bottom right of this chart, you can see that there's this connection again with Brighton and this kind of coastal area. And again, you do get this kind of rather interesting kind of feature, which is somebody starts off in, say, Guildford in the middle of the county, and then discovers that their clients have all moved down to Brighton, and the specialist company either opens a new office or it co-locates as well. So there's a kind of a tension here. It's really important that Surrey economically does maintain and grow its attractiveness to Createch, because that will also keep these specialist companies in the area as well. Next slide, please. So what would I kind of say to you are the key insights from the research that we've done about the region? Well, I think the first thing is that, the companies that are coming in, these Createch, have great growth potential. They certainly, if you look at, kind of some of the companies that we've tracked over just the 3-year period, they've gone from essentially one person working out of a bedroom at home to quite healthy kind of small and medium-sized enterprises. And if you look at some slightly further afield, for instance, at some of the generative artificial intelligence companies, like Stability AI would be an example in London, then that's actually gone to $1 billion valuation within a couple of years. So we're seeing within Surrey, there are companies that actually have that kind of potential as well. So you can see the growth rates for Stability AI in the second bullet point. I think the third insight I would share with you is that publicly funded R&D is absolutely critical. I mean, when we did this research and spoke to founders and we did our survey in 2022, it just kept on coming up that many of these companies would not have been able to progress their ideas without R&D funded by people like Innovate UK. And sometimes the funding's quite small, just a few thousand kind of pound, but it's more access to the kind of mentors and the knowledge sharing networks that sit behind that are so important. So the fourth insight is the corollary of that, which is these creative entrepreneurs, like a lot in the creative industry, struggle to get their financing. And they also struggle, to find places to work. And the two things are sometimes connected, because a lot of the incubators that have been set up within Surrey are just not right for these kind of creative businesses. And I think when you look at a lot of the investors, and we've tracked about 90 odd investors investing in Surrey in these creative companies, then the majority of these investors are outside the UK. So there's also a kind of a national kind of challenge here. Fifthly, is that a word? Fifth, finding investors, and learning how to work with these kind of different kinds of investors, whether a business angel or whether they're interested in scale-ups, is highlighted as a skill and knowledge gap by a lot of the founders we spoke to. If you think about a Createch company, they tend to either grow out the art side and then acquire some technology, or they grow out the technology side and acquire the art side. Arts and technology companies, arts and technology graduates generally do not have the strongest business knowledge. And so they're kind of at a disadvantage compared to, say, an MBA coming out of a corporate environment when it comes to talking to investors. I said that the spaces are not right. We know that Createch founders really want co-working spaces with a real mixture of other companies in there. They don't want to just go and hire an office. There's a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas that they benefit from. And a lot of these technologies are moving incredibly fast. Speaking as somebody from a technology background, I cannot believe how quickly the generative AI world has moved in 6 months. It feels like 30 years compressed into 6 months. So the only way you keep on top of that is you have to have a good network and keep talking about these things. And then the final kind of insight I would say is that, you know, that if you look at some of the international case studies that we've looked at, it's very, very clear that you need coordination between the public sector, you need further education, higher education, and you also need anchor companies, people who are prepared to say, I will mentor, nurture, invest in these kind of companies. I will act as their customer. I will give them a chance to get them going. And in some cases, you need these companies to actually say, I'm going to make a commitment to the region because I can act as this kind of stable anchor for an ecosystem of startups around us. So this is quite a challenge. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of close out my session really just saying, you know, that there is a particular area that worries Martin and myself, and I know a lot of others quite a lot, and it's all to do with skill and talent. Partly it's because of the speed of technological advancements, but it's also about some fundamental skill gaps in the people coming out of our various institutions. So, you know, if you look at a Createch, you need this mixture of creative, technical, and business all together. If you don't have one of these, then you're not going to be as successful. And what we're also seeing is that the softer skills, as they're often referred to, around leadership and problem solving and team working, somehow are not given the emphasis that they need in the different kinds of courses that these people are coming out of. And what that means is that they end up with various forms of collaboration challenges. They find it difficult to kind of have the right conversations with people across these different functional areas. And, you know, the bottom of the list, there's a whole series of other kind of challenges that are very specific to the region, like upskilling. How do you get older kind of people back into the workforce, into Createch? Because, you know, I'm no spring chicken and I know a lot about these technologies. So people like me are important in this as well. It's not just all about graduates. And, you know, we hear very much from the founders, we need customized learning paths, we need modular training that's very short. We know there are inclusivity and diversity issues and measurement around what's happening in this kind of area. Very, very hard to get on top of. And finally, net zero and sustainability, you know, passion area for Martin and myself, but we also hear this from the founders, you know, how do we get the specialist knowledge that we actually need? Next slide, please. So again, I'm not going to read through this slide. I just want to kind of shock and awe in a way. We did a mapping of the kind of skill gaps that Createch companies seem to be experiencing, and it's huge. And as you can see, you know, it's not just a set of creative or technology skills, although there's quite a lot there. There's a set of core business skills. And if you think of these companies as business to business companies, then, you know, things like how do you set prices become very, very important. How do you negotiate with a buyer, you know, at, say, Netflix? these are the kind of conversations that people need to be prepared for, and we've noticed that people are not. Next slide, please. So, Martin, do you want to just close out on developing the cluster in Surrey and surrounding region?
I need to turn my microphone on in the classic Teams Zoom manner. So thanks, Trevor. Yeah. So I'll just hone in on a couple of things we're looking at within specifically in the Surrey context. If I can move my...
It's gone very quiet, Martin.
Right. So I think the technology is back. Hopefully it's back up and running again. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
And hopefully everybody else can hear me now as well. So, in taking forward these issues specifically in the Surrey context and our collaboration now with Surrey County Council, there are really sort of three core options that we're sort of considering. And these are not mutually exclusive, but they are three strategic options to take forward the development, the growth and attraction and development of Createch companies in the region. And I'm not going to go into detail for time, but essentially, could we develop a network amongst these Createch companies and relevant stakeholders to sort of lubricate ideas and learning peer-to-peer, bringing in others as relevant? Could we secondly develop a network and then physical assets such as incubators or scale-up hubs? And thirdly, could we look at a much broader cluster or a cluster with even sub-clusters in different parts of the county? So there's sort of various levels that could be developed dependent on need and potential investment that emerges. So if we are to go to that cluster, option, bearing in mind, research and knowledge from other areas, what are some of the things that we will need to do or will need to happen? Well, certainly there will need to be access to investment and funding opportunities, both for the individual companies and the sort of, if you like, infrastructure to take the sector forward in the county. There'll need to be mechanisms to address the skills and recruitment issues that Trevor highlighted there, working much more closely with the universities, and also the technical colleges have actually come out quite as an important stakeholder in this. And some of the sort of other tertiary education, providers. So addressing those, those issues are important. Even within the context of a cluster, a lot of the learning will come through peer-to-peer networking, and you see this in places like Silicon Valley and whatever. It's that physical networking. It's not necessarily workshops with content in it. It's people who are doing stuff, meeting people and saying, oh, that's a good idea, let's do something. So that very basic form of a network and sort of a beer and and an olive, people chatting at the end of the day throughout the county, in different environments can be a very fertile mechanism to build that soft infrastructure that's really important. But also establishing a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem. So not just being about spinning off the technologies, maybe from the technical elements of the universities, it's also developing those business skills to take forward those technologies as well. So some of the barriers, you know, there's some of those sort of traditional barriers that you see. Also, you know, the challenges and perception of Surrey as being high cost, as Trevor had highlighted. You know, bridging and gaining access to investors and funders, and actually creating that link to public sector funding and funding opportunities, as again Trevor highlighted, that a lot of those businesses would not have got off the ground if they didn't have the 50k, the 100k, the 200k from places like UKRI. So the bridging and connection in and help through the maze of the different funding that is available, important. But also creating those links to the anchor institutions like Netflix, and being able to work, you know, across different borders and collaborate in different ways. Also, there are structural issues in Surrey in bridging some of the sort of different variations of economic development and within the county itself. And I think another final key one is, given that creative industries is one of the key highlighted 5 sectors by the government now, and given that key opinion formers in linked to the creative industries and research are now talking about Createch, and aside to that, digital technologies is one of those 5 targeted sectors. It's going to be, how is central government going to take that forward as a you know, how's it going to take it forward? And I think we're all waiting to see whether they distill that down into the so-called sector strategy that is due to be published soon. So where are we going now in terms of the activity within Surrey? Well, UCA and Surrey County Council are now starting to work up a plan in terms of Createch cluster development. We ourselves are disseminating our research in this workshop and through the website, the different reports. And the next stage from our side is we're building a tool to support Createch companies deal with their sustainability and net zero challenges. And as part of that, we are also collaborating with the British Computer Society. So we're developing a process to help Createch companies tackle these issues based on, again, some research that targets the actual needs and levels of awareness and development of companies. And we're not looking at that just within the UK, we're looking at that broader as well. So this is an example of the tool that has been developed and tested, and we are actively looking to engage with companies who want to work with us to trial and test. And again, we will be disseminating some more information on that in due course. So I think you've probably heard enough from me. I think for time, we probably won't take questions at this stage, because I know Dan particularly is on a tight time schedule. So if you do have any questions, can we roll those up to the discussion in the end? So I'll sort of now pass across to, and that's just if you wanted to quickly jot down our emails, if you wanted to follow up, but of course we can help with any connections after. But I'll now sort of finish up for the moment and pass across to Dan, who heads up economy and growth at Surrey County Council, for his reflections on the issues. And Dan, I'm happy to move the slides forward based on a next slide
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Martin. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So listen, thanks, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Murray. I'm Head of Economy and Growth at Surrey County Council. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak about the potential of a regional Createch cluster, specifically focusing on its contributions in terms of economic growth and innovation. It's great to be here on this webinar. I don't think I've ever been on a webinar quite like this, so it's great to be here and looking forward to the discussion later on. Next slide, please, Martin. Rather than go into really specific detail about Surrey's Createch cluster, because Martin and Trevor have done a brilliant job in presenting so comprehensively on that, I thought I'd use my 10 minutes just to talk about the role of local government, the facilitation and the enabling role of local government in cluster development, really thinking about the kind of on-the-ground practical application of the learnings and the research that we've just heard about. How do we turn that learning into reality and grow clusters on the ground? And I guess I want to just share some personal reflections following the last couple of years in my role at Surrey County Council. Before I get into that, I should say on behalf of Surrey County Council, we're really excited about the potential for a Createch cluster in Surrey. Trevor's presentation really demonstrated the huge potential of the cluster, and the idea of potentially positioning Surrey as a UK centre for Createch is really exciting. So as Martin says, we are working very closely with UCA and other partners, both in terms of providing some seed funding and also some officer time to contribute to the support of Createch as well as the rest of the cluster development. So we're looking forward to working with Martin and colleagues on that in the coming months. Next slide, please, Martin. So a few reflections then on cluster development from my personal point of view. So our emerging cluster development programme in Surrey has been supported by a strong strategic framework and evidence base. And I think that is critically important, and research like Martin and Trevor's really, it goes a long way to supporting that in helping us realise the potential of the spatial concentration of our innovation economy. So Surrey County Council in November 2020, we published the Surrey Economic Strategy Statement, a 10-year strategy up to 2030, and that identified 4 priorities and some associated growth propositions to support Surrey's economic growth, the first of which was growing the leading edge. And innovation and cluster development really sat at the heart of that growing the leading edge work, and it included a specific commitment to design and deliver a cluster development programme that I've been leading and working with others on. And the evidence base that went into that strategy also supported the identification of some priority clusters. Createch, obviously emerging, working very closely with Martin and Trevor on their work, but also gaming. Obviously, we knew that was a strong cluster that we wanted to support. But cybersecurity is another one that hadn't existed prior to that, and we wanted to take forward as part of our cluster development programme. The other key element, I think, in terms of cluster development is regional and local partnerships, and the point that it's not a particularly original point, but regional partnerships is hard work. It takes time, and I really think the role of local government is critical here. As a civic anchor institution, we have a critical role to play. We can be the conveners and the consistent enablers of relationships between university, industry partners, LEPs, district and boroughs, etc. And it's important that I think that we make it clear that we're here to stay, we're here to support, we're not going anywhere, and we represent and we can provide a long-term commitment to supporting the growth of our key sectors and our key clusters. So in our case, as part of that partnership process, we established an innovation board, or an innovation working group, which included senior innovation reps from our 3 universities, University of Surrey, Royal Holloway, University of London, and of course the University for the Creative Arts. As well as representatives from our science park, Set Squared, Surrey Incubator, our local enterprise partnerships, EM3 and Coastal Capital, our district and borough colleagues, and also regional reps from our innovation agencies like Innovate UK. And since its inception a year ago, that group has provided a forum for partners to come together to share information, and we're really starting to see the translation from kind of strategy to more of a delivery focus. We're beginning to work together on this shared innovation agenda for Surrey, including the development of the cluster development programme, and a number of funding bids have gone in, which I think wouldn't have gone in quite the same way they did in terms of the collaborative approach without that forum, bringing those partners together and enabling and facilitating that work together. So I think that's a critical role that we can play in supporting the clusters. Moving to the establishment of the clusters themselves, now I suppose I'm reflecting mostly about my involvement around the cyber cluster, where we've gone from 0 activity just over a year ago to a fully funded activity program, a growing cluster community of 200 plus within the cyber cluster, a cluster coordinator in post, an independent body, an independent entity set up to drive that cluster development. So I'm sort of talking about the reflections I had going through that process in the last year, really. And I think there's a number of things I would say. First, it's an obvious point, but it really is critically important to adopt a private sector industry-led approach. And I'll go as far as to say that cluster definitions, cluster visions, priority objectives, activities should all be determined by the individuals who work within the cluster, work within the industry. And we've got a great starting point in the Createch in terms of the research that Trevor and Martin have done. But that research needs to be tested with the cluster on an ongoing basis to make sure it stays relevant. And this private sector-led approach should really also be followed when considering the type of entity that we want to create to operate and promote the cluster, and also in terms of governance and decision-making structures. So, for example, going back to the cybersecurity example, we established the Surrey Cybersecurity Cluster Limited, which is a private company, limited by guarantee, with a majority private sector advisory board containing 4 cyber security industry reps, 2 university reps, and a public sector rep. So a majority private sector led advisory board. And this corporate governance structure does ensure an independent approach that's truly owned by the cluster communities, represented by the private sector reps on the advisory board. And having a separate entity is really helpful in terms of raising finance, leveraging funding from public, from partners or the wider public sector. So, for example, in the cyber case, we've been able to use the company to leverage funding from UK3C, which is the National Agency for Cyber Cluster Promotion, and that's enabled us, as I say, to employ a part-time cyber coordinator who leads on the day-to-day activities of the cluster. And I should have said at the start, we, Surrey County Council, have just are in the process finalising the process of appointing a innovation and cluster officer. So that's another way in which we can contribute to the to the cluster development program, and that person will be supporting the Createch cluster as part of their role, which is really great. Another key learning point I would say would be the importance of identifying an industry champion, someone to be the public face of the cluster. Ideally, this individual will be, as I say, a respected figure within the industry. And Keith Robson's role at Space South Central, I don't know if anybody knows Keith, but it's often cited as a good practice example of such a person fulfilling this important advocacy and promotion and leadership role within a cluster. So certainly thinking about Createch and our plans there, the idea of identifying an industry champion to be that face of the cluster, I think will be really very important. In terms of establishing the cluster's vision, its objectives, and its specific activity program, again, based on the work we've done elsewhere, the focus really should be on the needs of the cluster community. Again, Trevor's work's given us a good starting point in terms of thinking about, well, commercial space or an incubator, whatever it might be, we might want to think about. But it really needs to be the community of cluster representatives that should be developed, and then use that group as it established to understand what those needs are. So it's the cluster community who should be consulted to identify the cluster activity program, which, as Trevor's quite rightly pointed out, will obviously link to the cluster's ecosystem development needs. And this could cover a whole range of things. We've talked about skills and recruitment, and perhaps linking that to inspiring the next generation of workforce. So that could be linked to EDI challenges in terms of representation. It could be about commercial space, incubator requirements, access to finance or R&D funding, help with net zero transition, business support, export promotion, IP, commercialization, all those types of things. But as I say, it'll be the cluster community that need to inform the development of that program going forward. In terms of longer term monitoring and evaluation of cluster activities, we are in the process of developing cluster barometers for our priority clusters, and it's something I'm really keen to work with the guys here on in terms of the Createch cluster. I'm sure the work that Trevor's done will feed into that, which I think will be helpful in terms of establishing a baseline for our cluster's footprint, and will help inform the measurement of the cluster's development over time as it grows and develops, and helps us understand the impact, the outputs, the outcomes, the impact, the benefits that we're able to generate through the cluster development process. And there's lots of indicators that we could look to include as part of that monitoring and evaluation. It could be about collaboration and cooperation. It could be about specific support services that we're able to offer to the cluster. It could be about increasing the number of firms, the jobs, turnover, GVA, that sort of thing. It could be about increasing the competitiveness of the firms, or the productivity performance, or the volume of dedicated commercial incubator space. Lots of things to consider as part of that monitoring and evaluation process. Link back to the objectives, link back to the vision, and link back to the priorities, I guess, of the cluster. Finally, it's really important to retain a focus on the long-term viability, sustainability of the cluster in the longer term. And again, I think as local government officers and local government institutions, we've got a critical role to play here. Obviously, in terms of potentially offering some seed funding or some ongoing support, whether that's financial, but certainly dedicated officer time to help the cluster's advisory board to think about potential future funding models. And as I say, we've about to appoint a cluster and innovation officer who will be able to support our clusters on that endeavour. Next slide, please, Martin. So, in conclusion, I hope this has been useful and not too obvious, the things I've been saying. Hopefully it has been useful based on my experience, but just some concluding thoughts. Really, again, this can't re-emphasize this private sector-led approach. So important that it feeds and informs everything in terms of the vision, the objectives, the program activities, the governance, the structure in terms of how a cluster should operate. And linked to that, the idea of building this cluster community. It's something we've really focused on in the cybersecurity cluster. Build that community of individuals, students, organizations, businesses, and keep listening to what they're telling us they need, what they're telling us they want, and make sure that we deliver that as part of the development of the program. And finally, from a local government point of view, is that long-term, consistent institutional support. I'm not an expert in Createch. I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, but what I am hopefully good at, or my team are good at, is really providing that facilitation, that enabling, that convening, that enabling role to support the growth of our clusters. Thanks, Martin.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. As I understand it, you have to go at 4:30, so I think what maybe we just, if there are any specific questions for Dan before the other presenters, maybe you could just raise your hand. Does anybody have anything specific for Dan? Or the other option is, if you've got anything specific for Dan, to maybe put in the chat, and Dan could perhaps respond in the chat while the others are presenting.
Martin, maybe I can pull something out of the chat. Actually, there's a couple of people said that they're kind of interested to understand kind of Surrey's kind of view on collaborating with kind of adjacent kind of counties or other kind of people in the region. So maybe Dan, if you could say a little bit about your thoughts on that, it would be very helpful.
We're very keen to do that. I mean, a personal view, obviously, the people that pay my salary and my elected members are very keen on borders and very interested in that, obviously, from a political point of view, but from a practical point of view, we absolutely recognise that the Surrey economy goes across borders, and our clusters go across borders, and we're very, very keen to work with organisations across borders and work, indeed, businesses across borders as well. So absolutely, very, very keen to do that.
Thank you, Dan.
Charles's hand up is up.
Yes, I think really, Daniel, picking that up and your comments about partnerships being challenging and local government being probably one of the permanent partners around the table. And we're coming to the end of LEPS. What do you kind of see as being the future, as where will lead responsibility for economic development lie? What's your crystal ball saying? Because mine's not very good.
Well, I can only go back to what was quoted in the budget. The government are minded to, I can't remember the exact phrase was, but effectively withdraw funding from LEPS. And there is a working assumption, I think, that will, at least some of the functions and the funding will go to local government. So that is our working assumption at the moment. Obviously, the other thing that's happening is the work around county deals. And I know that Surrey County Council are working for a proposition around that as well, which hopefully will come to, because that was the other thing they committed to in the budget, wasn't it, to agree a whole bunch of new devolution deals in the next 12 to 18 months. So, and there will be definitely some powers and responsibilities and funding that go with the county deal. So I don't have a crystal ball, but that's that's certainly the working assumption at the moment.
Great. I think unless there's anything else burning for time, maybe we should move on to Frederick's presentation. And Frederick is the head of economy and is director of strategy and R&D for l'École de Design Nantes Atlantique. Apologies for my very poor French.
That's perfect, Martin. Good. So I'm the French guy in the room. You can imagine. Maybe I would just give you a few words and the feedback and a few anecdotes about our very own case of l'École de Design in Nantes, in Western France, which is so I will start from our very the very history of our own institutions, but try to relate this to the global context of Nantes and what is happening in terms of clustering and what is the role of creative industries in the economy in the local context of Nantes. So maybe first, if you can get it to the next slide. So that's me basically. I've been working for 23 years in these institutions, l'École de Design Nantes Atlantique, which is probably one of the major design schools in France at the moment. Next slide, please. And just to define the perimeter of the school, and what is basically the project of this very institution is that we are non-profit organizations. We are recognized by the Ministry of Higher Education. We got granted a label defining us as a school of general that is providing education, and it's part of a general interest project. We welcome 750 students this year, and we also part of those students are doing the studies in apprenticeship, so they're working part-time during their studies. We will have about 300 graduate students at master level in 2023. Which is a huge number for France. Most of the art and design schools in France does have 300 students, and we will graduate 300 people at master's level this year. We have about 350 lecturers. Most of them are coming from the professional practice. That are practitioners connected to the business and industry, and we also have at the very core of the curriculum a strong connection with business and industry, and we've developed over the last 30 years a lot of partnerships in different shapes. I would say most of the time connected to actual the curriculums, and then the fact that we will provide real world situations to the students to work on. And we're managed by the Chamber of Commerce. This explains why we are so connected with the business and industry, because the DNA of the school is really to provide skills and talents to the local economy, and that's really the point of the school. We're a member of the Conférence des Grandes Écoles, which means we are among the business schools and the engineering schools in France, and considered as a great major school. And we're also supported by the Ministry of Higher Education, and then we're connected to the Nantes University, which is like the university, the the greater university that is now we see very good recognitions also in terms of in academic terms, I would say. We developed the school in Nantes, in France, from a single location in France, and I will get back to this later. And we also developed a lot of activities worldwide, because we've opened studios in China, in India, in Benin, in West Africa, in Brazil, in Montreal, in Canada, in North America also, and we could say we are probably among the most international schools in design school in France at the moment also. Next slide, please. We kind of redefined what should be design education at master's level 15 years ago, something like that, in relation to the connection we wanted to have with the general needs of the companies and the business and industry, but also to what would be the emerging trends in society, and to have some sort of ethical and responsible approach to the global needs of the society. And we decided to start platforms. And we started 5 different what we call the design labs, which is basically 3 things at the same time. It's a place, actually. So it's a place where we can experiment and we can break things, actually. It's a set of courses at master's level where we train students at that master's level, and it's also a place for connections with business, industry, academic partners in a very research, education, innovation integrated manner. The 5 topics we are working on now. We started in 2010, and we opened the last design lab 1 year and a half ago. We're working on care, basically, so how to with many topics related to healthcare, but also to the public sectors. We're working on city, the evolution of cities and territories, basically working on every kind of cities. The digital design lab is working on the impact of digital innovations in our daily life. So it's probably the most connected to what you called Createch, Martin. The food design lab is about the system of food, and media design lab is about information and mediation and medias, of course. All this under the scope of a design approach to this in a research, education, innovation manner. Next slide. So maybe the most singular things I would say about the school. We went from 100 students in the late 90s, like 25 years ago, and we welcome about 1,750 students right now. And so we had like a 2 digits growth during the last 25 years every year, and with a single motto probably in mind, which is what we have tried to put in English here, that the conviction that the more designers we train at a certain level, at master's level, so people that are able to tackle strategic and complex issues, the more design and creation would be taken into account in all parts of society, through the organizations, through the companies, through the every place where designers can have an actual impact on the society. And that's really the motto. And in this, it did happen in Nantes, which isn't probably not totally a random fact. And then say next slide, because Nantes is as probably some places in the UK also as a very strong history into reinventing itself, I would say, all through the centuries, and also especially during the last 30 or 40 years. What you see here is a picture of the Ile de Nantes, which is the main island that is right in the center of the city. It's in the middle of the Loire River. We are about 60 kilometers away from the seaside, and then the city of Nantes used to be until the 80s, I would say, a very industrial and very commercial place with a very strong harbor, with many shipbuilding facilities and a very strong industrial activities that was located really right in the center of the city. And it's pretty much like a city like Liverpool, I would say, or something like that in the UK. And then it all stopped in the 80s. The airport, the warehouse, and so went to Saint-Nazaire, like where the bigger ships can actually get, and so and the shipbuilding was stopped, and everything was stuck in the early 90s. And so the city has to reinvent a part of itself, basically. So it was it was a bit of a pain, I would say, because there were lots of memories related to these activities, but also very good opportunities to reinvent a new model for the city. And then the institutions, the mayor, and so decided to invest into culture and creative activities to actually get people to get to those places and try to reinvent through a very ambitious space urban planning plan, reinvent this whole area around creative industries and creation. We're in a city that is the birthplace of Jules Verne. So he actually didn't spend much time in Nantes, basically, but nevertheless, it's the birthplace of Jules Verne. And there was this idea of connecting the industrial and commercial skills of the territory with some sort of a new model, of new cultural model. And one of the results is the things you see on the screen. Is this giant elephant, which is basically the work of a scenographer called François de la Rosière, who invented the huge scale machines. Actually, and then this elephant is now really part of the identity of Nantes. It's walking around in the area of the Ile de Nantes, and it's like an Eiffel Tower on that can move around, something like that. Very, very, very typical thing. And it has become a sort of a model for everything that is happening around this area. And next slide, please. And so
about 4 minutes,
yeah,
if possible. Yeah,
we can do that.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So, and what is happening in this area that through urban planning and then the setup of the whole area, there's now a huge cluster of I would say research and education institutions at the same place: fine arts, architecture, digital computer sciences, and so also companies and many things happening in this area. So the clustering effect is really based on the very political and institutional plan at first, but now it's working as a self-organized cluster. And we welcome in this area about 5,000 students in creative in disciplines, which is probably the most important community in creative disciplines in terms of students in all France, excluding Paris, which is a different story. Next slide, please. We had also another example that is interesting. I will go very quickly through this. We co-chaired for the last 6 years a regional program that's called West Creative Industries. So the idea was to answer to the European policy of the smart specializations, and then the local politic decided that design and creative industry was a smart specialization of the region, and we manage a an interdisciplinary platform for 6 years with the University of Nantes, mixing up people from research, education, and business and industry around the user experience as a driver for transition. So it was interesting because we started like very practical platforms like Design Factory, was inspired by Aalto University in Finland, and interdisciplinary innovation programs. So the idea was to cross like the Createch things, to cross fertilize the approach between, let's say, computer science, human social sciences, design, architecture, art, and so. And next slide, maybe. So after, I would say, a few years living in this environment and developing the school in these environments, we got a few statements right now. We probably got a far better recognition of creative industries, and especially in the digital economy area, as a driver for innovation and growth. So the whole vision of what should be creative industries, what are actually doing creative industries, is getting better. We got at academic level, we got a better interdisciplinary cooperation, which is probably a good thing in terms of expertise and then capacity of having a stronger approach to the field. We are still facing a problem. I think the UK is a bit better about this, but because the fuzziness of creative industries is very difficult sometimes to evaluate and to quantify, and can be difficult in terms of key indicators and what should be looked into the real impact of creative industries, and then it's not totally processed as a key factor of specificity, of distinction, I would say, for the local institutions. So we still need sometimes to we could be a little bit more, we could have a little bit more pride about what's happening in terms of creative industry than we actually do, to put it simply. And then Martin asked me for a small exercise at the end, so this next slide. And a few thoughts. It's not totally measured, but what's happening, what we are seeing now happening especially in the field of design related to digital application, but also in every fields of design, is that digital transformation of designs is not over yet. So we still have a lot of things coming up, I would say, in terms of productivity, in terms of new possibilities, in terms of lowering the entry barrier and being able to have a broader use of digital technology in the field of design and creative industries. And there is also questions about the maintenance, basically, what is happening in 10, 15 years ago, and how do we get to sustain a digital culture? The pioneering years is probably over, and now we must move to a more sustainable approach to digital culture. And there is also a lot of discussions, of course, about what artificial intelligence is doing to those kind of skills, and basically the discussions we're having right now is the soft skills, that was personal knowledge, critical approach to issues, sourcing and verifying, and so they're not turning into art skills, basically. So this will make the difference between what can a machine learn and what can a machine do, basically, in terms of design and creation. And maybe also to be a little bit on a different note, I would say, there is also this idea of rehabilitating low-tech or no-tech approach in the creative industry. So to have also to be open to different approaches in creative industries, and not so much related to technology, and because not all the technology will be sustainable. And that's all for me, Martin.
on again. No, thanks very much indeed. And I think maybe if people can sort of put any questions for Frederick in the chat, and then we can pick those up at the end, so that we can allow the other speakers to present, and then we can try and finish at 5 o'clock. So so please, yeah, put your questions for Frederick and for the other speakers as we go along. And I think Trevor is watching that very closely and can bring those into the discussion. So thanks very much, and I'll now pass across to Charles, and over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Martin. And it's a great pleasure to be talking with this group, as were so many friends who I've worked with in the past on the call this afternoon. And I think you, Martin, and Trevor have kind of talked about the data, so I will quickly pass over that. And I think Daniel is probably also very much more familiar with the direction of travel with government policy. But my background is that for the last 10 years, I've been trying to embed culture and creative industries into the work in South Hampshire. And prior to that, I worked with Culture South East to embed culture and creative industries policy into regional policy with CEDA and Regional Assembly. So next slide. I think the first thing to say is regional policy is constantly changing. The regional development agencies existed from 1999 to 2012 and produced regional economic strategy and a regional observatory and an evidence base, and the creative industries was one of the priority sectors. This was contested. I think there were a lot of people, although the evidence supported the strength of the creative industries in our region, there were a lot of people, and I think this still persists, who didn't see creative industries as being proper business. I think that remains a challenge. The LEPs came into existence in 2010, and I think that challenge was even greater with the LEPs. I think Enterprise M3 didn't really acknowledge creative. It looked at digital and innovation, which covered the creative sector, but didn't actually like the word creative. And that's even more true with Solent. The LEPs, as Daniel was saying, will gradually wind down. Last year, the government announced the skills improvement plans, which are being led by the Chambers of Commerce. I think both Surrey and Hampshire Chamber of Commerce really see the creative and creative tech sectors as being important. And I want to make sure Trevor's slides are fed into that process. So I think that's a real opportunity. What next? I think Daniel was saying about county deals. I think that is a really good possible scenario. My guess is we won't actually know what's going to happen until after the next election as to what the final conclusions. But I think actually the process for embedding the creative tech sector and developing a sector group to represent the creative tech sector remains the same, whichever approach is used. Next slide. I think the first point, and Martin, you made this point really clearly, is the fundamentals are really strong. The creative sector in Nestor's Geography of Creative report in the Aldershot Guildford cluster is immensely strong and is unusually techie. I think it's kind of got 1.5 times representation of creative businesses, and 70% of those businesses are actually in the IT footprint. But as you explained, that footprint goes much wider into the film, into games, into digital marketing, and other parts of the creative sector. So we have an enormously strong techie creative sector in Surrey, in Guildford, across into North Hampshire. And it is slightly different from the creative sector in the rest of the South East region as was. and it is definitely different from the creative sector across the rest of the country, particularly outside London. I mean, work CEDA did showed the creative industries radiated out of London along the main arterial routes, and the strength is really much closer into the M25. Just outside the M25 is the strongest part of the creative sector outside London. But the growth rates have spilled on to the coast. Next slide. The recent State of Creativity report that Nesta and the Policy and Evidence Centre produced had this really interesting quote, where arts meets technology is where magic happens. And I think that really describes what's going on with creative tech. And I think what I would say is that in general, government really desires this high growth part of the creative sector, but has never really understood it. And this kind of really was highlighted at a conference Creative Network South ran, actually pre-pandemic. And I think there were 3 case studies which came to my mind when putting this presentation together. First one was from IBM. There was a discussion about the new design studio that they built at Hursley, just outside Winchester. And I think the realization in IBM was that they were losing out to companies such as Google and Microsoft, not because their technology was behind them, but because their user interface wasn't as good. And so the way they responded to that was to increase the number of designers they employed and change the ratio of designers to engineers. And indeed, that had some success in that they developed products such as Slack, which for a time were very successful and spun out. I think the second example was a knowledge transfer partnership. Portsmouth University set up with a company called Data Aviation Systems. These are the people who analyze black boxes after aircraft crashes. And they wanted game students, and they wanted environmental designers for a very particular reason, because they were able to show what had happened during the flight in a very much easier to interpret way. And I think that crossover into other sectors is hugely important. And I think certainly along the A3, both in Portsmouth, Fareham and the cluster around Portsmouth, and up to Fareham, the cluster around Guildford and Aldershot, the relationship with engineering and the defence sector is really significant. So it's not just the creative sector. Creative tech impacts on many other sectors. The third example, and I think, Trevor, you touched on this, was about the students. There was a student from Solent University, game student, Aaron, who had set up a really successful gamification business. He built online training packages for the emergency services, where they were able to safely simulate all kinds of scenarios. And that business actually was bought out after 3 years. But he was a graduate, passionate about what he did, passionate about games, and passionate about how that could be applied. But his skills weren't in business. They weren't in getting funding. They weren't in how to grow a business. And I think that pathway from a creative graduate into setting up a business, scaling that business, requires an awful lot of support. I think we also hear an awful lot about STEM graduates setting up tech businesses, but far less from government about arts graduates. Whereas actually, I think probably arts graduates are at the hub because they're used to freelancing, because their career pathway is so much less secure. And so I think that pathway from arts to tech is really crucial and hasn't so far been recognised by government in the way it needs to be. Next slide. I think the kind of narrative about the creative industries and a story a senior civil servant cited to me was that that narrative started with Ken Livingstone, who wanted to find a wheeze to fund artists who were doing live events in London when he was in charge of the GLC. And it always had a political overtone, which is why sometimes I think the creative industry narrative has been contested, particularly in the more conservative areas, more conservative counties. And I think that's something we need to overcome. On the other hand, digital and innovation are unambiguously good and growing fast and have a clear evidence base. I think it's often been about terminology rather than actually the type of businesses that government has wanted to support. I think the same thing is happening in education, where in recent years STEM has been seen as good, whereas arts has often been seen as bad. And I think that's a great mistake, because again, the arts graduates are very often the people who are setting up the businesses, which then fire this growth and then employing STEM graduates around them. Again, because their pathway to job security is far less clear than the STEM graduates, who very often can be employed by blue chip companies very quickly. A lot of the arts graduates go through a period of freelancing in setting up their business. I think actually Trevor's point about IBM is really significant, because the biggest growth of tech businesses in South Hampshire has come about following the closure of the IBM offices in Lakeside, where a number of IBM alumni have set up businesses in their 40s and 50s. And that knowledge base has been a huge driver of the digital and creative tech sectors in the south of the county, in the south of Hampshire. So, final slide, I think. I hope it's my final slide. This goes back many years that at Culture South East, we produced a publication about embedding culture and creative industries within local strategic partnerships within local authorities. But I think the model actually works for economic development. There needs to be some kind of sector group, and I think Daniel's points about governance are very clear. I think the point about having an industry champion is incredibly useful. I think it's, whereas in telecoms and in defence, big companies like BT or BAE Systems have been able to take the lead in building these groups. That doesn't happen in the creative sector or in creative tech, because the businesses tend to be so much smaller. They tend to employ less than 10 people. So I think it needs an anchor, and that could be higher education, it could be local government, but it needs an institution that will drive the development of the sector group and bring in business to surround it. We've been very lucky that the Chamber of Commerce in Hampshire has hosted Creative Network South and brings with it an awful lot of value in terms of business support. But I think HE and local government need to be key. I also think there needs to be a strategy and a manifesto, and I think the work, Martin, you and Trevor have been doing provides a really big leg up into having that kind of strategy and explaining what's needed, whether it be access to space and equipment, whether it be business support, whether it be skills development, whether it be networking. I think there needs to be the manifesto making the case and an ask. I think then there need to be some really good demonstration projects to show what can be achieved when things get going on the ground. And finally, there needs to be a constantly and well-stewarded evidence base. And I think, again, the work you've been doing has put that in place. So I think, actually, there's a huge consensus about what's needed, which has come from all the speakers this afternoon. And I think we're very well placed to do it. What geography works? I don't know. I think the Surrey geography has a very clear, distinctive economy. But there will be partners around the edges who would definitely benefit from the same approach. And I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive about geography.
Well, thanks again, Charles. And again, I think for time, we'll pick up the questions from the chat, and we'll move on to the last presentation from Ground Waves and Nick, who's one of those Createch companies going out and trying to make this happen. So I'll pass over to Nick.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Martin, and Trevor also, and every one of you listening here today. It's a pleasure to be on talking on your Createch cluster based around Surrey. But I think for the moment, I'll do a bit of freestyling here because there's some great words that have been said here. And I'd like to hone in on a bit of my story. So I'm Dr. Nick Inno, I'm the CEO of Ground Waves. My journey's been, I've always been passionate about tech. I went to a John Cabot City Technology College as my secondary school, and that was sponsored by Rolls-Royce. So I'll come back to that as an important part of the journey. Since then, I went to Cardiff University, did an undergraduate in electronic engineering, and then I went to do a PhD in nuclear fusion engineering. And beyond that, I've actually, during my undergraduates, been working on a passion project, which was trying to get the best feeling of sound, and especially in these low frequency waves. Recent evidence suggests that that is really the emotional connection with music. And so therefore it sort of validates the work that I've been on for the last 15 years, trying to develop these actuators, which will allow you to feel the sound, not just hearing it. So yeah, as a sort of summary of what I've heard here today from you, the great speakers, I'd like to thank Daniel, Frederick, Charles, and of course Trevor and Martin, is that there needs to be anchors, whether that's governmental civic anchors or blue chip company anchors. That's going to be key to helping these regional clusters develop, and having some sort of central body which has got the funds that won't run out, that people trust. And I think that's sort of what I've heard from there, so that's good to hear. That feeds back into my school. As I said, we were sponsored by Rolls-Royce, so we had a lot of ability to go on school trips to Rolls-Royce, learn what they're doing. There was opportunities for work experience, there's opportunities for postgraduate experience, and obviously that was the deal that I guess Rolls-Royce and these technology colleges tried to do in the late 80s, early 90s. So I can say that worked. And what I observed from my school is not that many people went into top tech. There's about, maybe about 2% or something of us. But what I did observe is that a lot of women went into quite big technology companies, and that's different from what I've seen in other schools that were in my age group. So I think that's a very good way from an educational point of view to make maybe underrepresented groups in tech more au fait with the scene of technology. So that's a comment there. In terms of how we move ahead as the country, we're based off of blooming technology. We've got a fantastic legacy, and I believe there's a bright future ahead, but we do need to move at speed and we need to move efficiently. And I think this is what Trevor and Martin have been so dedicated at trying to figure out, is how to move forward. And I think it's a great idea to start off with one cluster, which is sort of a shining star of where we can move before we move into more porous areas and expand that cluster. I mean, I'm calling here from Bristol, so I guess that's expansion's already slightly happened. But I'm here to help Martin and Trevor in their Surrey cluster at the start, because it needs somewhere to focus on first before expand. It's interesting to see that the Surrey Guildford area maps, the technology companies tend to be around the same areas, which may show very good trends there, that clusters do work. And that is the way to sort of move forward before expanding out between clusters to sort of bridge that knowledge gap. From an engineer's point of view, I put my engineer's hat on rather than CEO. This country is awful. Finding people to make something for you, just the simplest thing. You have to go to a proper engineering firm and they charge through the odds. I heard a story from a professor the other day that in Manchester in the 80s, if you needed to make something, each person in their front room would have a different machine. So you just need to go down one street and you'd be able to get your pressing, your lathe work, your turning work, your machining. We kind of need to get back to that level if we want to get developers developing their technology at the leading edge of what they can do and not being restricted by, I can't find this, I can't afford that, I don't know who to talk to. So I think this is a great idea of what you guys are doing. A comment on that is also competitions. I think competitions are going to be key to enlivening the spirit of the UK's innovation sector. So I attended Techno Games back in 2003, run by the BBC. That was a great show. And some of that tech still hasn't been surpassed today, or I see it coming in. So where has that gone? You know, why isn't that some sort of UK-wide science competition where there are leagues or whatever? Because I think that would, you would get a lot of education, you would get a lot of collaboration there. So, and the third thing, the last thing I'll talk about here is B corporations. We know B corporations, you get a star if you subscribe to a sustainable thing. What if we have an M corporation? Trevor was talking about companies which actually put aside some money or support for small companies, access. Maybe to get that M corporation badge, you need to have shown that you can do that. So companies, big blue chip companies, actually have something to work towards to be able to help the UK unite in that way. We talk about pub talk. Unfortunately, Martin, as we know, with the amount of drink driving, cost of fuel, and also the closure of pubs, pub talk is not happening as much as it did in the 80s and 90s. So we need to think of a new way of how we're going to communicate. And this new generation, I'm 88 born, but so I wasn't affected so much by computers, but only 5 years later, 1995 born, they have no idea how to communicate in that same sort of old way. They're much more on their phones all the time. So is there a new way we have to get that pub talk going? And that's why I think competitions are a no-brainer there, because that will bridge the gap. You want to be seeing your team win, not on your phone texting what you've been eating that day. So sorry, I'll just go with a summary of that. Next slide, please. So our journey is Groundwaves. As I said, we've been on it for 15 years. Can I have a time check, if that's okay? Sorry.
If you could keep it to about 4 minutes if possible.
Fine.
So then we got 15 minutes at the end just to pick up on questions and observations and stuff.
Yeah, let me just start that. Okay, so yeah, our journey is 15 years. We started with a chair, a full body haptic seat, and took it to a lady called Dame Evelyn Glennie, who's a percussionist, a deaf percussionist. She learned everything through feeling. She said, this chair's the best experience of sound I've ever had. But your foot plate isn't as good as it could be. Move on a few more years, I didn't have much money, and I was trying to think, what could I make that's small and portable, because that's what investors said would be more attractive. The fashion for women has switched from high heels to thick sort of soled shoes, and I thought that's a great place for real estate, for technical real estate. So that's where we developed a new type of actuator, which is much smaller, much more power dense, and then placed that in this wearable machine, which is the haptic shoes. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I think Trevor has very clearly, and all the speakers have said, we kind of know what a Createch company is now, and it's great that Sir Peter Bazalgette and others are now speaking about this word that's new in our dictionary to some degree. And as I'll go back, as I said before, to make this country great again, I think we need to have less kings in their castles of research. And we all know those professors that have just got £10 million grant, they want the whole new lab done, and that machine that's specialist to them, they don't want anybody to touch it. But why? It's being unused for 90% of its time. What if another researcher, a small business, that could be critical to their development? So I think, like that I see from Japan, there's a lot of sharing between universities and corporation and university, small business, university, corporation. And I think that needs to be made much more efficient and porous if we want to succeed. Maybe if you get a machine or a piece of equipment, you have to subscribe it to a national database where everybody could say, you know, can I use that machine at some point? That might be a change for the books, and get these people who hold this tech to themselves and keep it in their castles, sort of sharing more. And as I said, sharing knowledge is best. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think we've been speaking about the cluster creations. Once we've created these clusters, it's about collaborating them and making them work efficiently. The knowledge gaps in one feeding into the other. And, you know, we've got this great country that's only, you know, going to be an hour, 2 hours to get physically to each other. Whereas America, you know, you've got a day to, you know, quite a few hours travel from one place to another. So I think we should benefit from our locality, even though these clusters are regional, there isn't far to travel between. And also, as I said, maybe a manufacturing technology network, not just a knowledge transfer network, so that people who want to build things or make things have access or knowledge of how they can do that, or who are specialists in that thing. What if I need some sputter coating of a specific material? Who do I talk to? You know, replication of machines really annoys me when you go from one department to the next and they've got exactly the same machine, yet neither know that each other has got one, and they could have both used just one. So I think if we want to be more efficient, either both those machines are helping others or they just have one machine. It might be a way forward. The next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, Groundwave's challenges and needs at the moment, technical help has been a challenge. That's been helped thanks to the Digital Catapult's Future Scope program that we've just been on for 16 weeks. Access to finance has been a key bottleneck to Groundwaves. But now we've thankfully had the My World program, which is a local regional support fund for creative industries. So it's exactly what's Martin and Trevor have been speaking about has actually happened now. We've actually managed to get some funding to move our ideas forward. And as I said, as a third, a key is access to blue chip partners. You know, our tech can connect people. Sony is a connector there. Apple's a connector. We should be talking to these companies because we've got licensable IP that could help them. And likewise, their strength and numbers can help us. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'd just like to say thank you. I'll wrap that up now. And I hope that was a good summary of what I've seen from my perspective. Another thing that I think is critical that Trevor mentioned is learning in school, or in education, that needs to be specific to, like, how do I talk to Netflix? You know, how do I put a license deal together? Because these are going to be the things they need to do. How do I talk on stage? The learning of rhetoric needs to be number one, if not very high up the chain there, because people need to be able to accurately describe their situation and argue their case. And that's me. So thank you.
Okay, great. Just a quick couple of observations based on your presentation, Nick, and then maybe Trevor, if you could sort of pick up the questions and themes also that you've seen as well. So, I mean, I'm sort of interested in a couple of things that you talked about. Is that you're saying at a school level, that lubrication between those interesting companies, you know, getting people going backwards and forwards, they're being introduced, they're seeing things. So it's actually at an earlier stage than even thinking about the technical schools, the universities, whatever. So that was interesting. And also in terms of the sharing the assets issue, the whole, let's say, the wider makerspace, hackerspace idea. And of which that whole movement, if you want to call it the movement of the makers, modifiers and fixers that are coming together in repair cafes, in maker spaces, in hacker spaces, tech hubs, but in an organic manner, which is good, but maybe there are opportunities to design that more effectively. Are starting to see some particular we ran an event in Rotterdam a few years ago, and that technical school or whatever it was, the technical university there, are indeed doing exactly what you're saying. They're offering subscriptions to go in, use different kit. And even at UCA now, we're opening up some of our studio space as well along those lines. So I'll just leave that one to the side, Nick, and then pass across to Trevor just to pick up on a few things for the last sort of 10, 15 minutes or so.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I mean,
guys.
I think looking through the comments in the chat, I'd say the big question is really about how big do you make a cluster. You know, there's I think there's a kind of a subtext here, which is that maybe just looking at Surrey as the boundary is really artificial and you know, maybe just a consequence of stakeholders. But for success, you might need to take a broader kind of perspective. And I was going to ask Frederick maybe just to comment on that, because I know, you know, the Quartier de la Création Nantes, you know, has been a huge success, kind of generally, and actually is kind of, you know, covers really a lot of the broader region around the Ile de Nantes. I just wonder, Frederick, if you could say a little bit about, you know, kind of what defines the boundary around, you know, what's going on in Nantes. Is it political? Is it, you know, driven by the businesses? Is it just driven by, you know, kind of who chooses to collaborate with whom?
Yeah, there is a very specific mindset, I would say, that is probably not specific to Nantes, but probably most harbor city as this kind of a, basically we are living in a territory that is basically connected to the outside world, and it's getting and then actually the entrepreneurs coming up from everywhere are welcome in the city. That's a very strong feeling. So that there is so whenever you come from people from coming from the Netherlands in the 4 or 4 centuries ago were welcome in Nantes. Basically, the guy who created the Lu biscuit factory, you know, it was located in Nantes. The guy was from Strasbourg or somewhere like that, so from eastern France, and he managed to get proper opportunities, funding, and so in Nantes, and that's really a part of the identity of the city, basically. So it's open to new projects, new people, new entrepreneurs, actually, and they will find an interesting ground to grow their projects, basically, and that's a very strong part of the identity of the city, whether it's connected to business, to industry, to the digital economy, whatever the point, the creative economy. It's really something you can find in Nantes.
So it's kind of like that ease with which kind of kind of diversity can just naturally occur. That's one of the keys to success.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we still have Chris Birchall on the call? Because there were quite a few comments about LEPs, and I think it kind of, there seemed to be again a kind of a suggestion that LEPs were not going away that quickly, so therefore the LEP influence will continue to shape a lot of the UK thinking, in particular around geographic borders for kind of economic development, as much as the kind of political boundaries. Chris, are you still on the call at all?
I think he's dropped off, Trevor.
Yeah.
So, but maybe
does
Charles,
anybody else have a view?
Maybe Charles might have a view on that.
I was wondering if Charles, might have a view on that.
I mean, I don't think my view is that LEP thinking necessarily shapes the future, but I think for the next couple of years, there will still be quite a lot of funding within the LEP structure.